Hello, I'm Vernon Billy, CEO of the California School Boards Association. Since March of this year, we all have been reeling from the impact of the coronavirus on our schools. This pandemic has truly shaken the fabric of our society and upended our entire school system in so many ways. I get it. So before I go any further, I want to commend you for your hard work and commitment you and your school leaders are demonstrating during this unprecedented time. I know it hasn't been easy. Sometimes there may be few obvious answers to the questions you face, but as your association, CSBA is committed to providing you with critical updates and tools that will help you navigate this crisis. You can find all of this information at www.csba.org/coronavirus. That's a special webpage we've built to capture crucial information for schools confronting COVID-19. I encourage you to visit this webpage and take advantage of all the resources on the site. We update this page almost daily, and it can serve as a valuable source of information for you in your fight against COVID-19. In addition, we'll be doing webinars on important topics related to COVID-19 guidance from state and federal officials, as well as topics directly related to your governance responsibilities. These webinars will complement the information that we currently provide on CSBA's Online Learning Center, which also includes curriculum related to the pandemic. We have a lot to offer, but we want to hear from you as well. I encourage you to also use this webpage to share your experiences on how your district or county office is addressing the challenges related to this virus. CSBA will continue to work on your behalf as this crisis unfolds. The vital role your schools play in your communities has never been more apparent. I thank you for your leadership during this tumultuous period and pledge to support you and our students through this challenging period. Thank you again. Be safe and remember to practice good social distancing.
Hello to everyone out there joining us virtually. We appreciate you taking time from your very busy schedules during this hectic period in everyone's life. I think you've joined us for a very important topic. During COVID-19 response, school districts are dealing with so many challenges. Running a school is a very difficult task at the best of times, and COVID-19 has presented new complications, raised new questions, and new obstacles to overcome. This is true in all aspects of education, from providing meals to providing instruction, to engaging and communicating with students, staff, and families. But perhaps nowhere more than in the area of special education are new questions arising as schools try to continue to serve students to the best of their abilities and to provide every student with a high quality education. But there are some unique challenges specific to special education that we are here to address today. And thus the title of our webinar, Special Education in Extraordinary Times. And we're going to discuss how schools can best serve students with special needs and disabilities during this pandemic. It's absolutely one of the most crucial topics for schools to understand, and it's an equity issue, it's a human rights issue, and we are going to try and demystify some of the challenges that schools are facing and provide some guidance on how you can best serve students with disabilities now and in the future. Before we get to we are fortunate to have with us not only CSBA legal staff, but also legal staff from our partners, as well as special education educators from the county level who have deep experience in this topic area. I'd like to begin by introducing you to Ron Wenkart of Atkinson, Andelson, Loya, Rudd, and Romo. Ron is a partner at that firm. Also a partner at her firm, Lozano Smith, is Sarah Garcia. Welcome, Sarah. Also would like to introduce Anjanette Pelletier of the San Mateo County SILPA. Anjanette is an associate superintendent there in San Mateo. Last but certainly not least is Catherine Miola, CSBA's Chief Legal Counsel and also Director of our Education Legal Alliance. Catherine will kick off today's presentation. So with no further ado, Catherine, if you would begin your presentation.
Thank you, Troy. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Troy mentioned, we are in unprecedented times, and you hear that a lot today. And there's a lot of uncertainty, and that's certainly true about how to provide distance learning and when we will reopen schools, and if so, what they will look like when we do reopen. So in these times when there is uncertainty, it's best to go back to basics. Next slide, please. We know that the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act requires schools to provide a free appropriate public education, or FAPE. And what does that mean? So let's look at that. FAPE is an individualized education program that is to meet the child's unique needs from which the child receives educational benefit. And FAPE is delivered through an IEP, or an individualized education program, through special education, which is defined as specifically designed instruction, and related services, which is defined as transportation and development, corrective, or supportive services. Next slide, please. The IDEA is a federal law. Right? So the highest court in the land is obviously the US Supreme Court. And the first time the US Supreme Court looked at the IDEA was in 1982 under a case called Rowley. In that case, the US Supreme Court found that of the roughly 8 million students with disabilities, approximately 1 million were excluded entirely from the public school system, and more than half were receiving inappropriate education. And thus came the IDEA, or the Act, as it's called through these cases. The court noted that the IDEA does not provide a standard. Instead, the court said specifically that the standard was noticeably absent. And the court said that there is no one test for measuring that educational benefit that has to be provided through FAPE. Ultimately, the court decided that school districts need to provide what's called a basic floor of opportunity to access specialized instruction, which is individually designed to provide educational benefit. Next slide, please. You might have heard this sort of notion, when we talk about educational benefit, you might have heard this sort of notion about a Chevy versus a Cadillac, or in today's terminology, it might be a NISSAN LEAF versus a Tesla. The saying is attributed to the Rowley Court, but actually was not coined or said by the Rowley Court, but was coined by a lower court in 1993, 11 years after Rowley, where this court said that what school districts are required to provide is the equivalent of a serviceable Chevrolet versus the parents' demand in that particular case for a CADILLAC program. The school districts are not required to provide a CADILLAC of services. And then you fast forward to a recent decision by the 10th Circuit Court in Colorado, which found that if a student made some progress, more than de minimis, merely more than de minimis, it was sufficient to provide FAPE, okay? And you might have recalled that during the confirmation hearing of Justice Neil Gorsuch, because he was asked about that particular standard that was relied upon. And there turned out to be that there was a split in the circuit courts between this standard of more than de minimis versus meaningful educational benefit. So next slide, please. So the court in the US Supreme Court, for the second time, looked at the IDEA in 2017, 35 years after Rowley, and unanimously reversed the decision that was based on the standard that was found by Justice Gorsuch about the merely more than de minimis. In the Andrew F. case, the US Supreme Court reaffirmed the Rowley standard, which is the basic floor of opportunity, and said schools must offer an IEP that is reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. And reasonably calculated requires prospective judgment. So that means that you must make this forward-thinking judgment by school officials in the offer that you're making. And it's also fact-intensive exercise between school officials and parents. And the Andrew F. case, the U.S. Supreme Court also recognized that judicial review or review of the IEP will question whether it is reasonable, not whether it is ideal or perfect. And they also recognize that the IEP is not a form document. Subsequent to the Andrew F. case, the Ninth Circuit, where we're here in California, says that the standard also includes whether the child made progress toward the goals set forth in the IEP. Okay, so next slide, please. So then you come to the U.S. Department of Education. We know that there's no additional waivers that are going to be sought with regard to the IDEA, and that the U.S. Department of Education indicates that individualized education must take place for all students, including students with disabilities, within the framework of the department's core principles. And those core principles are health and safety of the students, teachers, parents, and educators, and administrators must be paramount, that learning must continue, that decision-making must be based on what is best for students, and that parents must be informed and consent to those changes, and that services must occur differently, right, during COVID-19. So next slide, please. So putting those two things together, that is the standards that we talked about from the Rowley case and the Andrew F. case, and the standards from the U.S. Department of Education, and you meld them together to this time where we need to indicate that IEP services are thoughtfully considered, right, and reasonably calculated for a child to make progress on goals through distance learning. We need to document the reasons why we're making these services, and why we believe those services will allow the student to make progress. We need to involve the parents in the decision-making of those services, and we need to review progress towards the goals through the distance learning period and also when we return to school. So there's a number of components there. There's the reasonably calculated, which is forward-looking, right? And then there is whether the child made progress on the goals, which is backward-looking. And in both of those standards, we have to involve the parents or legal guardians in those decisions that are made. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ron Winkert, for the next section.
Thank you very much, Catherine. It's a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to have this opportunity to share this information with you today. The next set of slides is going to discuss the legal standard for compensatory education. The words compensatory education are not in the IDEA itself, but were derived from various court decisions. Thank you for moving that slide forward. The IDEA authorizes hearing officers and courts to award relief that is appropriate in light of the purposes of the IDEA. And from that language, the courts derive the concept of compensatory education. Compensatory education is an equitable remedy. Compensatory education seeks to make up for educational services that the child should have received in the first place, and aims to place disabled children in the same position they would have occupied but for the school district's violation. So basically, if you have a violation of the free appropriate public education standard that Catherine mentioned earlier, then there's a possibility that the courts may authorize appropriate relief in the form of compensatory education. Next slide, please. So what the courts have done in a number of cases is they've ordered extra educational services to compensate for the past deficient program. And so it's a remedy that is granted prospectively to provide a student with a free appropriate public education under the IDEA. So the purpose of that award under the IDA is to put the student in the position the student would have been absent the denial of FAPE. So basically, like you said, it's a prospective remedy. It's supposed to restore the child to where they would have been had they not been denied a free, appropriate public education. If you could go to the next slide, please. The award of compensatory education, like I said, is designed to compensate for lost progress that a child would have made and to make the student whole. And now it's not a exact science. It's not a one-for-one. So if the student loses an hour of speech therapy, for example, that the student is entitled to 1 hour of speech, the courts will look at it on a case-by-case basis and determine what is needed to provide the child with a free, appropriate public education. So if we could go to the next slide. Okay, so the previous slides have kind of talked about what the courts have done prior to the COVID-19 epidemic. So now we know what the legal standard is in the best of times. What's the standard in what are not the best of times? How will the standard be applied post-COVID-19? Will they award compensatory education? Will they look at remediation? Will they look at whether the school district has acted in good faith by providing distance learning, providing the best education they can under the circumstances? We don't really know at this point. We're in unprecedented circumstances. Keep in mind, these are unprecedented circumstances not only for schools, but for the courts, for the judges, for the administrative law judges, the hearing officers that are going to hear these cases. Their lives have been disrupted. The courts have been disrupted. The courts are closed. The Office of Administrative Hearings is holding telephonic hearings. So they're aware of the disruption, and they are aware of the challenges. And so it remains to be seen, though, how they will take that into consideration when it comes to applying the compensatory education standard that was applied prior to COVID-19. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So the question really is, I'm sure this has been in your mind as well. So we've got an order from health authorities to close our schools. We've got social distancing. We've got wearing of masks. How do we provide a program for students, especially severely disabled students, who need one-on-one attention or who need someone to guide their education? It's very difficult to provide that education through distance learning, online or through the telephone, or by having a parent assist, particularly if they don't have devices, particularly if they don't have internet connections and so on. So it's very, very challenging. Educators are doing their best to meet that challenge. We could argue that under contract law, if there's a possibility of performance due to a natural disaster, it's impossible to perform under the contract. That might be a way of looking at it. The courts may look at it that way when it comes to deciding in a particular case whether the district gave its best effort, whether they made a good faith effort, or whether it's impossible to perform. We'll just have to wait and see. It could vary from circumstance to circumstance. If distance learning is the only option, then should school districts be penalized if students didn't meet their goals on their IEPs? It's hard to answer that question. We'll just have to wait and see what the courts do and what the hearing officers do. So I'm sorry that we can't provide you with any solid answers to some of these questions, but I think if school districts make a good faith effort, the chances are that the courts and the hearing officers will consider that when making decisions. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Sarah Garcia, for the next set of slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron, for all of that information. Landscape on the legal landscape that has brought us to where we are today. As Troy said during the introductions, I am a partner at Lozano Smith, specializing in special education law. But before I went to law school, I was also a classroom teacher. So I'm always trying to bring to the law a really practical perspective. And my goal during our presentation time today will be to talk about, in the context of all of those questions that Ron and Catherine have just laid out for us, how do we come up with practical approaches and practical solutions to put ourselves and our students in the best possible position moving forward? So if we can move to the next slide. This shows you a timeline of activity between March 12th and March 20th related to distance learning and special education. This demonstrates just a small snippet of the large conversation that was happening immediately during the time period that we were facing school closures, and understanding how many unanswered questions there were at that time period. We were, as of March 13th, when things began to really shut down statewide, we were really in a position of reaction. It was happening very quickly, and we were scrambling to find as much guidance as we could, especially for our students with disabilities and special needs. So we were getting a lot of communication and a lot of answers, but as we will talk about during this section of the presentation, not all of the information we were getting was consistent, and it didn't always answer all of our questions. And much of the information we've been given has been non-binding, non-precedential guidance to suggest how we should be addressing things, but not necessarily changes to the laws. As Catherine talked about during her presentation, the IDEA is a federal law. We also have California Education Code state law covering special education. And because it is covered under both federal law and state law, there have been very limited waivers in the area of special education. And for the most part, we remain legally responsible for everything that we were legally responsible for before the school closures. And so how, from a practical perspective, do we implement that? So let's address that a little bit. Move to the next slide, please. So one of the things that happened shortly after school closures was SB 117. And this was a California law that was passed that gave us extremely limited waivers for special education in California. As Catherine mentioned, the IDEA is federal law, and the state of California does not have the power to waive federal requirements. They can only waive additional protections that they have put in place above and beyond the federal law. So the waivers that we were given by the state of California were extremely limited. These were the only actual changes to special education law that have been provided. They include a waiver of the obligation to provide student records within 5 days of a parent request, for example. 5 days has always been a very short timeline, and during school closures, it's very difficult for schools to gather pupil records in response to a parent request to provide copies or access to those. So the state has waived that requirement, but there is a general education requirement under California law that also requires records production, and there is a requirement under the IDEA that requires record production within 45 days. Those have not been waived. So we have a very limited exception, and the exception is only for purposes of compliance with the production of records. It is a procedural waiver, not a substantive waiver. So the production of records is also associated with parental participation in the IEP process. And parental participation in the IEP process is a very important parent right, and that has not been waived. So we have to understand that even where there is a procedural waiver, we still have substantive responsibilities to make that good faith effort that Ron was talking about, to make sure that our students are getting the best that we can provide, given the circumstances and in light of the circumstances, in compliance with those programs. The other very small waiver that was issued was related to assessment plan timelines. The law, for example, requires 15 days to generate an assessment plan from an assessment request. That has been waived because there are obviously very real difficulties in performing assessments in person during school closures. So there's an acknowledgement that in-person assessment may not be able to happen. Originally, we were given federal guidance regarding assessments that suggested there might be a waiver on the federal side for the IDEA regarding in-person assessments. However, shortly after that suggestion, we were told that in fact, that requirement remains in place, and that if we aren't going to be able to meet timelines, we should seek parent agreement to extend the timeline. So even where these limited exceptions have been made, our substantive requirements remain, and these don't really answer the bigger questions with serving our students with disabilities that we've really been looking for answers to. Next slide, please. Beyond the legal changes to statutes, we have also seen a lot of guidance in the area of special education. Guidance from the U.S. Department of Education, guidance from the Office for Civil Rights, guidance from the State Department of Education, telling us how to address things, suggesting strategies, suggesting options. It is important to keep in mind that this is not binding guidance. This is a suggestion. This is a recommendation, but it is not something on which we can rely as a justification for why we choose to do or not do something. It is merely a suggestion. We've been given guidance, for example, in the area of assessments. And as I mentioned a moment ago, originally the federal guidance suggested that there would be a waiver regarding in-person assessments because in-person assessment is not safe at this time. That was then pulled back, and instead we were recommended to get waivers of those timelines from parents if we were not going to be able to meet the requirements. We've been provided some guidance regarding IEP documentation and how do we document IEPs during this time period. And we have been told we should be using technology, we should be convening IEP meetings, that we may not be held accountable to the timeline compliance for annual and triennial IEPs, for example, but that substantively we should continue to document the IEP meetings and parental participation in those IEP team decisions. There was a lot of discussion immediately after school closures about whether IEP amendments were necessary to document the changes required by distance learning for the state's students with special needs. There was a lot of differing advice and differing conversation in response to that question. After a few weeks of conversation, we received some guidance from the state of California saying that if the only change to a student program is that it's provided through distance learning instead of in person, then a district would not need to complete an IEP amendment, that the distance learning portion of that program is out of the district's control at this time. However, that did imply that if other changes were made, if, for example, the student is receiving individual speech services instead of group speech services, if the minutes are changed because direct service is no longer possible for physical therapy and now it is consultative. If those changes are made, there is a lot of belief in the field that an amendment would be necessary to document those changes and to document the parental participation in those changes moving forward. Again, this is all from guidance we've been given, and what's important to keep in mind is that no waivers have been made to any of these laws at the federal level or at the state level. We are still responsible for implementing the free and appropriate public education that Catherine outlined at the beginning of this presentation. There has been guidance related to parental consent. How do we document parental consent moving forward? And we've been recommended to use the technology that we've been using for meetings to also document parent consent. Parents can sign in a variety of ways to show that they are in agreement with the program, to show that they are participating in the program. We've been encouraged to use everything at our disposal to make sure that everyone has a voice in that process. We've also been given some guidance regarding preschool transitions. Under the IDEA, Part C of the IDEA governs services for students 0 to 3. Part B governs services for students between 3 and 22. That transition at the 3rd birthday is very important and requires assessment to happen between what's considered an individual family services plan prior to 3 and an individual education plan after 3. We have been told that those requirements remain in place and districts are responsible for making sure, one way or another, that as students are transitioning at 3, they are provided what they need by the school district. As Ron said, We haven't necessarily been given the answers of how to make that happen, what the practical results of that requirement are during school closures. So a lot of this guidance has created more questions. But what we're talking about is trying to make practical responses in light of all of these questions. Let's be practical and figure out, how do we document the great efforts that we're going to make sure that our students are being appropriately served? Because that's the business that we're in. We're in the business of educating kids. Even in spite of the worldwide pandemic we are facing, we are continuing education, and we are continuing to make great efforts on behalf of the students within our district. We want to make sure we can document that so that we can use that to show the efforts that we've gone to in spite of the factors that are outside of our control. Because as Ron was explaining, that is how we will be in the best position to address claims of compensatory education when all of this is over. Next slide, please. So something that is extremely important is, in that documentation, creating a record to the greatest extent possible of compliance with our legal obligations during this time period. The way we comply during this time period is going to look different. That's a practical reality, and both the state and federal government have acknowledged that that is a practical reality outside of our control. So in order to make the argument that in light of those circumstances, we have provided FAPE, and to demonstrate compliance in light of those circumstances, we want to make sure we document all of the efforts that we are making. We want to make sure we are having open, transparent, and frequent communication between our staff and our parents and our students. And we want to document all of that communication. We want to make sure parents are involved in the process, that they know what's happening, and that they are members of the team, even if we are not all gathering in the same room. We want to make sure that we have documented service logs, keeping track of every minute we are investing in our kids during this time period, making sure we're documenting the phone calls, the emails, the text messages, the Zoom meetings, the team meetings, everything that is happening, because our staff are putting in extraordinary and exceptional efforts to meet the needs of their students during this time period. And the more documentation we have of that, the better it is, not only for us legally, but also from a practical perspective, to show what our students are receiving and how they are benefiting from those services. And we want, to the extent possible, to be documenting and demonstrating progress on individual goals. Every student who has an individual education plan has individual goals as part of their program. Those individual goals are written for a year, and we are documenting progress on those goals throughout the year. That is a more difficult challenge during remote learning. It is more difficult for our staff members to monitor and track those skills and to keep data on what students are doing. But we want to come up with creative solutions, whether that is using our classified staff to track data during a session between a teacher and a student, whether that is gathering data information from the parents for what they are implementing during distance learning in the home, or whether that is creating extra Zoom sessions or office hours between staff and students, making sure we have the opportunity to actually query progress on goals. And that progress might look different. We might be monitoring interactions between the student and the speech pathologist instead of interactions between the student and his peers, because the practical reality may be limiting those opportunities. But we want to document that as well. And the more documentation we have, the better. All of you who have worked over the years with your attorneys, I'm sure you have heard us say, document, document, document. During this time of school closure, when we're not all physically together, that written documentation becomes even more critical. Next slide, please. As we mentioned, on March 13th, when everything changed, we were really in a position of being reactive to circumstances that were happening to us. And now, what I would really like to recommend is that we begin, as much as possible, to be forward planning in our thinking and our communications. I know school boards all over the state of California are having conversations now about how we address things like extended school year for our students with special needs, how we address fall, whether we will be reopening on regular schedules, some sort of modified schedules, or still in a distance learning format. There are also conversations happening all over the state about whether future school closures will be necessary. This, we have said over and over, has been an unprecedented time. We couldn't have imagined before March 13th that we were going to be where we are now. Now that it has happened, and now that we see that it's possible, now that we know this is a reality that we can get to, we need to be prepared in the event that it happens again, so that we have proactively thought through and planned how to address that for all of our students, including our students with special needs, instead of being in the reactive position we were in this time, so that we are thinking through how do we make sure we are prepared to document and provide those services in a distance learning model moving forward. Next slide, please. And as we are doing that forward planning, I want to encourage us to be thinking through, for the sake of our students, not only what we have continued to say is our first priority right now during this time period, which is physical health and safety of our students, our staff members, our families, and our communities. But also, not just physical health, looking at the mental health needs and effects of this time period. We have students with special needs who have very specific mental health challenges, and those challenges are exacerbated by the current circumstances and situations. And those are needs we need to be working hard to address so that our students are available for and can access the education that we're continuing to provide. Education is continuing. We want to make sure we're providing the services necessary so that our students can continue to access those. We also want to be making sure that we are planning for the privacy needs of our students during that time period. In this unprecedented time, we have very quickly scrambled to get the technology in place to address the needs of our students. As we're forward planning, we need to make sure that we're partnering with technology partners who will protect the privacy information of the students, minor students, who are using that technology to access learning and education. We don't want their private information to be accessible to or published in any way by those technology partners. And we want to make sure we're having those conversations now in terms of forward planning. And we want to make sure that we're really looking at those plans through the lens of equity. Students with disabilities have been affected by the school closures differently than some of our other populations. But so have other groups within our school settings. And we want to make sure that we are thinking through the equity implications of all of that beyond the technological divide, language access issues, issues related to parent support in the home, students with food inequities and insecurities, students with housing insecurities. We want to make sure that we are looking at all of these plans and forward planning through the lens of equity and making really practical plans as we move forward to address those issues in the context of not only providing education for our students, the business that we're in, but providing it well and equitably as we move on. And given that, it is my great pleasure to turn it over to Anjanette Pelletier from the San Mateo County SELPA, who is really going to share with us her wonderful experience and leadership as someone working in the field to address these very difficult times. Anjanette.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you so much, everyone. I am from San Mateo County SELPA and will be trying to present both a local perspective and also an overview of the things that I hear during my statewide meetings with other SELPA administrators. So I'm ready for my first slide. As everyone else has said, during this time of rapid shifting to distance learning or other hybrid models, we've really had a statewide situation of uncertainty As many of my colleagues have shared, there's been a lot of guidance, a lot of resources, a lot of things that have been provided that is not necessarily binding or directive. And so as we have shifted to whatever style of distance learning your staff have been providing, it has been quite impressive, the range and scope of services that your educators are providing, while at the same time, it has been quite challenging. I think it's really important for board members to know that for special educators, sometimes they are doubly impacted. They are attempting to teach their students and provide consultation to their families and provide consultation and collaboration to their peers, because many of their students are provided service in the general education environment. So those students are receiving both their regular supports from their general education teacher and from the special educator. Or some special educators are consultants for a myriad of students on their caseload who are in a variety of more restrictive settings, such as special day classes. So I do think that it's really important to remember that those special educators are likely doing double and triple duty in some cases. One of the statewide uncertainty things that we have really been working through is that there's been some slow progress on clarity regarding the impact of regulations for some of our specialized service providers. However, we are starting to receive more specific guidance about the capacity of speech language specialists, OTs, and PTs to provide direct service via a telepresence or an online or virtual activity. And so we're really feeling, as we move forward and move into that forward-thinking planning for the future, that we will be much more nimble and much more capable of providing a robust set of services. And finally, right now, as all of you I'm sure are thinking, there's really this unknown impact of how much has this cost us so far? And how much is this going to cost us in the future? And we don't really know what's going to happen with the budget. And so all of those things really have contributed to some of the uncertainty across the state, but it really has allowed us to be sharing information and resources across the state to see if we can support each other as we move forward as SELPA leaders to share information so that no one is reinventing the wheel and no one is having to be all alone in the decisions that they're trying to make. Next slide for me. As we've heard from other speakers, many LEAs have created distance learning plans. This really is sort of a summary document, an umbrella document that we are using in the state of California. Many places have decided to call it something else, but it's very common for them to be called some type of distance learning plan. And this should outline what's being provided to all or most students, and also can be used to identify unique or individualized services that are being provided to students with disabilities. Of course, as we've heard, individualization of IEP services and supports provided during this distance learning time really should be individualized, meaning that the team should be considering those issues together and should be discussing those. But we also know that the LEA always gets to make the final determination on what to offer on any distance learning plan. So we need to make sure that your special educators and your directors are clear that they have the authority at the local level to indicate what they will offer and what they believe they cannot offer, either due to public health orders or due to the resources and limitations of their current staff and their current capacity, depending on the local conditions. We also think it's really important for teams to consider that the distance learning plan should really reflect what's achievable and to reflect on what are the meaningful educational benefits components that you can be sure of providing given the circumstances. Very important that we ensure that distance learning plans are not one size fits all. So although that umbrella statement of what's offered to all children should be written and clear, we probably should not be relying on things like every child with speech is going to get 30 minutes a week. We probably should be looking at what's really our floor that we can put as something that's available to everyone, and then what are the individualized considerations for this student. Please go ahead to the next slide. So we also heard that we received some guidance around amendments. So I thought that I would share with you what many of the LEAs that I've been in contact with have decided to do. As it was shared, we received some advice and then some different advice and then some advice that referenced advice that wasn't advice. So what many LEAs have decided to do was to move forward in a way that made the most sense for them, using that advice and the best of their ability to decide what's right for their populations and their communities. So most LEAs created some type of amendment process for their teams to follow. I heard from many LEAs across the state where prior written notices were used to provide that blanket distance learning plan overview as what components would be available to all students. This provided parents with a prior written notice that they would be receiving different things via the distance learning time than they would if they were in the brick and mortar in-person service provision model. We also have had many LEAs decide that they do want to move forward with some sort of documentation of an amendment that indicates the individualized differences on the distance learning plan for each family. As Sarah was saying, this allows the families to have an opportunity for participation and consent. And so most of our IEP systems have an amendment process that allows us to have many notes about what we're offering that could be different. And so lots of teams are continuing to move through that process. There may be IEPs that were needed to be held sooner and some that are still happening. Some may be really a phone conversation with families, or some may include a Zoom type meeting. But statewide, amongst the SILPA peers, which we communicated to the district level peers, we felt like it was best practice to not change our service pages because we did not feel that for the most part, that distance learning plans represented the fate that we would actually offer if we were in person learning. So it shows that across the state, there has been some continuity in practice. Please go ahead to the next one. Oh, one more thing about this before we go on, but you can keep on that slide, it's fine, is that several of the IEP management systems, the online documentation management systems, have recently come up with a methodology for electronic signature. So one of the things that we've been discussing across the state is what kind of consent should we be receiving? An email, a phone agreement, DocuSign, which can be quite expensive. And so most of the IEP systems have been working on an online electronic signature. And the largest one, SACE, announced its release of its online signature this week. So that's good news. Sorry about that. Next slide. So one of the things that I'm sure that board members, I know superintendents and special ed directors are currently in the midst of is thinking about what are we going to do about ESY? So as Sarah was saying, we have to be thinking about physical safety, mental health, about keeping students making progress on their goals and objectives. There are all sorts of technical issues to review as well. I've put some here on the slide. And what I know across the state is that we have a lot of people having to figure out what are their local resources, what is the local pressure and decision-making that will be made by their leadership team, and how are they going to decide which populations they can best serve under all of the unique situations that may be present in your local environment. The one thing I do know is that special ed directors really need the support of the leadership team. They need the support of the other educators and leaders in their system, of the superintendent and of the board, to know that those decisions are not theirs alone, that they are implementing the decision-making of the district on behalf of the superintendent decision-making for the district as that head leader. We do know that lots of districts are electing to continue with distance learning for the extended school year. We have lots of districts that are trying to figure out, could they start a smaller or modified program, for example, using the child care guidelines. And many of these considerations are critical in order to figure that out. There are still questions about ESY funding, about what that cohort model for students might look like. And underlying all of that is the issue that extended school year, ESY, is an eligibility program. Under IDEA and under an offer of faith, ESY is considered based on that individual child's demonstration of a potential for regression or difficulty with recoupment. So it's not an enrichment program, and it's typically not for all students with disabilities. So we really have been having discussions across the state about being very cautious about what we call any summer program if it is not for students who are eligible for ESY, but if it is instead meant to be a remediation program. So those are all things that you may want to consider or think about at the local level. Next slide, please. So for me, one of the big issues, going all the way back to Ron's discussion about compensatory education, is really that across the state, we have been encouraging a common message about the need for remediation. This pandemic has caused an upheaval in the way that we have provided teaching and the way that learning is occurring. Your educators have done an amazing job of rapidly shifting to new methods, new ways of providing service, and many students are receiving contacts from their special educators. But what we know is that all students, general education and special education, will require some type of remediation due to these school closures. Special education is built on the foundation of general education. So special education should not be considered separately from your general education considerations about remediation. It should be all students, and then what are special education issues in particular. We do know that LEAs will need to individually consider the issues of compensatory education for students with IEPs because that's what's in IDEA. But we do think that it would be appropriate for every LEA to not have the concept of automatic compensatory education as a requirement. As Ron was saying, and as Sarah underlined, usually compensatory education is a relief awarded to the family because of some sort of violation or failure to act on the behalf of the LEA. And we do not believe that for the most part that there has been a denial of FAPE for children that the LEA, because the LEA did not act. This is an issue where it's been challenging to provide FAPE because of something that has happened across the world. So we really want to encourage people to make sure they're communicating. We will consider any issues of compensatory education individually, and to have teams be firm in their confidence that compensatory ed is not necessarily a requirement and or not necessarily a one-to-one coverage. And we also want to make sure that board members and school leaders remember that the IEP team will be critical for making those conversations and commitments when we return to school. And so it's really important for all members of the IEP team and members who are not on IEP teams to really be cautious about making commitments or statements about compensatory ed prior to that return to school. And that's it for me for now. Those are some things I wanted to share. Thank you so much for including me.
Thank you to Ann, Jeanette, and to all our presenters. Very comprehensive in terms of the amount of information that was provided to members. And if you weren't able to absorb all that in one take, rest assured, we will get this information to you in other forms. It will be posted to the COVID-19 website on Friday. And from there, you will be able to view not only this recording again at your leisure, but also to go through the PowerPoint deck that all the presenters provided for you today. So again, thanks to our presenters, but we're not going to release you just yet. We're going to go through some of the questions that our audience has provided. Again, if you want to submit a question and haven't yet, please use the question function in the dashboard, but we're going to dive right into the questions we've already received. The first question pertains to classified staff. Specifically, the viewer wants to know, how can we utilize our classified staff to support students and teachers? And Jeanette, would you take that question, please?
Absolutely. So many of our classified staff really have received training, support, and they are excellent at implementing the IEPs under the supervision of their teachers. So now is really an opportunity to consider a range of activities that your classified staff could be participating in. Many LEAs have started having their classified staff have access to online PD, webinars, modules related to their areas of expertise or areas where it would be nice for them to gain expertise. There's a whole plethora of resources available on the internet, on the CDE website, and of course, a fee for service. But lots of your specialists may be able to provide webinars or online PD training for them. So that's one idea. We also know that many of your classified staff are used to working with your specialists, your teachers and your specialists, to collect data or to monitor the activities during group work. So that's something that the teacher and the classified staff member could coordinate. The classified staff member could log on to the Zoom meetings and keep that data for the teacher, or could track information that's happening during those group sessions. Additionally, many classified staff, especially those that are often assigned as one-to-one staff provision, might have specialized skills under the supervision of their certificated staff member that they could continue to implement. So their classified staff member could coordinate with them, and they could make arrangements for that certificated classified staff member to connect with that student and parent and implement some of those goals, implement some of that instruction that's been designed by the credentialed staff member. Many of the credentialed staff members know, everyone knows that the credentialed staff member has to develop and create that material, but lots of classified staff members are very capable of implementing that, keeping data, and then checking in with their supervisor via phone, Zoom, or email, so they can continue to provide that service.
Thank you, Anjanette. Our next question comes from the parent perspective, and the attendee wonders, how are special education parents coping with their special needs children for everything from meals to behavior? What measures can be taken to help special needs students struggling because their usual routine has been disrupted? I'll throw that one to you, Sarah.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question, and one that hopefully we're having a lot of conversation about. Throughout the state, parents have had to adapt quickly and in extraordinary ways to supporting students at home all day. And that is students with disabilities and all students. It's been very challenging for me personally to adapt to those things. Household, I am working full time and supporting the homeschooling component, distance learning component for my 7-year-old first grader who does have special needs. So it's a challenging situation. And there are a lot of resources available that have been shared through other webinar series, other guidance that has been issued. I would recommend that any parents who are struggling check out the webinar series that the California Department of Education has released, for example. The State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tony Thurmond, has created a Circle webinar series specifically aimed at addressing the needs of parents during this time period and supporting parents during this time period. There is also a webinar series called Supporting You, Supporting Students that was specifically aimed at addressing the mental health needs, both of our families and as they support the needs of our students. I think it's important that we really continue having that conversation in a meaningful way. We are, due to the current circumstances, dependent in many ways on the ability of parents to make their students available for education and to help them access learning. And so in order to do that, we as districts need to be thinking about how do we support those parent needs? How do we remove any issues or stumbling blocks that the family is facing so that we can get to the point of educating the children? A little bit like I was talking about before, about focusing not only on physical health, but mental wellness. That really is something we need to be focusing on for all of our families and communities and staff members, in addition to our students, and really seeking out those resources where we can. For practical issues like technology, meals, districts have created a lot of resources very quickly. And so we would encourage parents to get in touch with their district office if they haven't done so already, to inquire about any technology needs, any food needs, and make sure that they are plugged into the resources locally to help keep their children engaged in the learning process, because we do want to make sure that education is continuing, but in order to continue education, we have to be, meeting some of those basic needs first. And acknowledging, I was explaining to someone earlier this week, this is not normal times with more technology. This is new times, this is different times, these are different challenges than we have faced before. So we can't just assume that putting the technology in place solves the problem. We also need to understand that additional concerns have been created by the pandemic itself, and have some open and transparent, consistent communication about meeting those needs as well.
Great, thanks for that response, Sarah. Your point about technology is well taken. However, the next set of questions do deal with technology. There were a couple questions which I'll combine into one. The first question asks, what is the recommendation for IEP meetings during shelter in place in terms of how they're conducted? Similar to that, another attendee wondered, what are the best ways to provide distance learning services with students that have special needs or require special speech services? So Catherine, would you answer those?
Sure. I think taking the language that we have been presenting on today should give the answer, which is that it's the best, whatever is the best for the parents. In other words, if the parents have access to a computer and can do a Zoom meeting, great. If the parents have access to a computer and they have email, great, we can do it through that way. Or if it's telephone, and if it's not telephone, then packet. But bottom line is that we should continue to be holding those IEP meetings, as my panelists have talked about, the fact that the meaningful participation of the parents is a key component to providing faith, right? It might, these services during this distance learning plan might look differently than what the IEP initially called for, but you do that because we're required to do this, because we're in a situation that that we're all in, that is the pandemic. So with regard to having the parents be connected with the school district and also involved in the decision making allows for the school district to hold the IEP in any way that the parents can participate. So that's the best way to do it.
Great. And then the next question is more a point of clarification. Prior to some recent announcements, there had been discussion about whether districts could provide services equitably in this current environment. And there had been talk, not common, but the issue had been raised that some districts may be considering suspending all instruction so they didn't run afoul of any equity guidelines. And could you address that question, either Sarah or Catherine, and about the need to continue instruction, even if it's not looking exactly the way it would during more normal times?
Sure. Sarah, do you want to start?
Sure. I think, that goes a little bit about what I was talking about with us getting a lot of information at the beginning that was very reactive, and then some of the messaging changing around what was happening. At the beginning of school closures, nobody knew how long this was going to last or how long we were going to be in this environment. And there was some question about, if we provide nothing, is that defensible? Fairly quickly, both the federal government and the state came out and said, education continues. The ADA waivers, for example, that schools have been provided, some of the federal funding that schools have been provided in response to this pandemic are dependent, in fact, on services being provided and education continuing. So I think it is universally accepted at this point that it is not a good strategy to be providing nothing to anyone, and that everyone should be provided access to learning as we continue educating through distance learning.
Right. And I would tie back to the standard. That's why we wanted to get back to basics with regard to the standard of FATE, because the IDEA is about access. It's about providing students with disabilities access to the educational program in a way that allows them to make progress. That's the point of it, right? And so to the extent that we're providing education, we should be providing that access to the education with students with disabilities as well.
Great, thank you both. I'm glad that we cleared that up. Didn't want to leave that hanging in case anyone was considering that route, which we definitely do not recommend. The next question relates to the reopening of schools and any special considerations that districts or county offices of education should be making as we look to, at some unknown point in the future, reopen schools in a safe manner. Is there anything specific to special education that leaders should be considering?
Yes, I think it's remediation, and I'm going to go back to Anjanette with regard to those her slides on that point.
Yeah, and I think that it's really important for their local leaders to connect with their county office and their county public health officer. There may be dramatic differences between one county and another in terms of what phase they are in of reopening and what unique considerations they have to consider. And also know that you are going to, for the most part, need to bargain a lot of the return activities. Our bargaining units are very concerned about their own health and safety. And I do think that it's a really challenging time. We will have both people interested in returning and parents who are very fearful for their children. We will have parents who need their children to return to school in order to return to work. And we will have children who are medically fragile and whose parents may not be interested in them returning ever again or until there's a vaccine. So you're going to have to approach that with both sensitivity and practicality, because you will never make every one of your constituents happy.
Thanks, Anjanette. And you touched on this a bit in your response, but could you just explore a little more deeply how schools should be working with students who have regressed during this time off or time during distance learning, and how can schools compensate to help those students?
I think that unfortunately, as with all of the guidance we have received, there's really no one. I think that what we should know under the principles of child development is that all children are regressing right now. This is not a normal time because of the intense mental health and anxiety pressures based on the world. Most children are not responding in a normal manner. Most adults are not responding in a normal manner. Our mental health, and in some cases our physical health, really need to be our top priority. And when you think about children who are showing regression or behavioral challenges or new mental health challenges, communication is really critical. Parents to communicate with districts, districts to communicate with families, to figure out what might be appropriate and possible for those children. The one thing the CDE website does have is a long variety of distance learning webinars that basically highlight some really great ideas from across the state, utilizing resources for small and rural LEAs all the way to large urban LEAs with their own mental health staff. So there are a lot of resources in that people have shared ideas about how to be responsive, and there have been including outside experts, and really there's no one size fits all answer, so I'm sorry about that. And really the critical answer is just communicate and try to figure out what can be done and what are we just going to have to plan for.
Right, and then I just wanted to add, that is why Ron talked about the standard with regard to compensatory education and it being an equitable standard. Ron, I don't know if you want to expand a little more on what equitable means in terms of, the legal standard.
Sure, I would be happy to. I think the courts, when they look at equitable, they're going to take into consideration the impact of COVID-19. I don't think they're going to look at it in a vacuum. First of all, they have to say that there was some type of intentional act or act by the school district to deny a free, appropriate public education to students. If there was no denial, there's no entitlement to compensatory education. If it was beyond the control of the school district, if it was due to the circumstances and not exacerbated by the school district, there may not be an entitlement to compensatory education, which I think is separate from what Ann Jeanette was talking about, is remediation, that all students are going to need remediation. So I think if we address it in that scope, and if parents see that we are trying to do the best we can during these times, and that, excuse me, that we're going to remediate all students, including special ed students, to try to bring them back up to their goals, I think that will decrease the number of compensatory education claims. If school districts just take the attitude of, oh, well, that's just the way it goes, then I think you're going to increase the number of compensatory education claims. So I think it's very important how the staff approaches it, how the staff communicates with parents, how they try to accommodate the parents as much as possible. I think that will go a long way to decreasing the number of compensatory education claims.
And I just want to,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Ron, I think that's, sorry, Anjanette. Ron, I think that's great. And I think that's so important to keep in mind. And we've talked a lot about how we don't have the exact answers on compensatory education yet, because we as lawyers advise you based on what judges have said in the past, and judges haven't said anything on this yet. So there are some unanswered questions. But what we do know is that we can always come back for forward planning to that FAPE standard that Catherine talked about at the very beginning, bringing us back to those basics. And we know that the snapshot rule tells us on any given day, the individual plans we need to be making for a student with disabilities are based on what we know about them today and where they present today and how to move them from today forward. And so I think when we come back to school, it's going to be really important to in-person learning. It's going to be really important to differentiate between these two concepts, the compensatory education concept that we don't know where it's going to go yet, and the FAPE standard of when they come back, we take them where they are, and we work the same way we always have, thoughtfully and individually, to move them forward from that point.
Agreed. And I think that the only last thing I would say is this also circles back to what you were saying, Sarah, about document, document, document. Because if we offered something, if we provided something, if we reached out with that engagement, we need to make sure we have that documentation so that we know what was offered and provided. One of the things that we currently been working on in the state is a prior written notice for families that aren't engaging. So, you know, we know that there will be a range of family responses and student responses. And so we really are encouraging your staff to document every effort they make. If they sent an email, if they mailed a postcard, if they invited people to Zoom, every single outreach opportunity, and of course, every single engagement should be documented.
Right, and that's
absolutely, documentation is essential, absolutely essential.
Yes, I 100% agree. It's also tasks that can be performed by classified staff. To the extent that we received a question earlier about what those, what classified staff can do, that is one of the tasks that they can do, absolutely. So.
That was a very provocative question, obviously produced a high volume of responses, but we want to keep it moving and get to a few other questions in the time we have remaining. And one of our attendees said that at one point, it was suggested that students transitioning from Part C to Part B stay with Part C services until an evaluation can take place. Is this true, or should they transition if assessments can't take place for those students we know will need continuation of services?
So I talked a little bit about that during my slides, so I will take that. This is, again, one of those places where the developing guidance has not always been consistent. The original guidance was presented on the theory that what might be best for students is to continue under Part C until the in-person assessments and eligibility determinations could be made by school districts. And there were some letters from advocacy groups that encouraged that approach. Ultimately, the requested waiver that would have made that the standard practice was not issued. And instead, what was issued was guidance that said, in fact, school districts, K-12 programming, are responsible for serving students as of age 3, without necessarily answering the question of how do we do those assessments. And so there have been some practical strategies tossed around for how do we do that. What the law allows is for a school district to either at age 3 continue the individual family services plan or create an IEP. And so a lot of LEAs throughout the state are choosing through this distance learning period to, as a school district, adopt and continue the IFSP, Individual Family Services Plan, until that eligibility assessment can be conducted and the student transitions to an IEP, which typically happens before age 3. That is a practical solution that has been discussed and brainstormed by people in the field as one of the ways to address this problem. There are others that have been bandied about as well. And again, I think what is important is that we are thoughtfully addressing this, that we are documenting every effort that we are making, and that we are making good faith efforts to serve those students as of age 3 to make sure they have the opportunity to continue accessing learning and education.
Thank you, Sarah. Another attendee has a question related to equity in the context of access to technology. She wonders, how can board members guide districts to implement equity for all special education students when there is not enough digital equipment or hotspots for students to connect to distance learning? So this is a question that districts are facing for every member of the student body, but she's wondering if there is some special consideration or liability perhaps related to special education.
If I could maybe address that, just a couple of points. I think it's really important to utilize your classified employees and your transportation contractors, your bus drivers, to assist with that. You can park buses in neighborhoods and create hotspots. That might be practical in some districts. You can deliver instructional materials, equipment, supplies, all kinds of things to parents to assist, both for general education and special education. I've been involved in negotiating some contracts for transportation companies and bus companies, and to continue their payments through the end of the year. And in some of those contracts, they've agreed to deliver instructional materials, deliver food, deliver equipment, supplies, create hotspots for families that don't have internet connection. So there's a lot of things. There might be some resources there that you can use to assist both general education and special education parents.
Great. Thank you, Ron. Another person wonders whether electronic signatures are sufficient for full IEPs and amendments, or are they only good for IEPs and not for amendments as well?
I think they're sufficient for both.
Okay. Great. That's
I
simple.
wasn't sure if that was a question about the SACE system or not. It is true that right now the newly announced feature on SACE only works for full IEPs, not for amendments. However, there's a workaround. Your team can use the signature page from the SACE feature and use and sort of bypass it. And SACE has already been made aware that we need that for the amendment page as well, and they're working on it. So it's been up for about 12 hours, and I'm sure it will continue to be adjusted to meet the field's needs.
Right.
Great.
And
So hot off the presses. That's important info.
yes, and then there are other options as well. Parents can can sign the document and take a picture of it and email that picture or text that picture. They can send an email saying they agree to the services, and again, the district should be printing that out and putting that as part of the student's file. But there are a myriad of ways to electronically obtain written consent. The requirement is written consent rather than oral, but electronic consent is certainly sufficient for that legal requirement.
Great. So there are a number of ways that districts and parents and guardians can address this issue. That's good to know.
Yeah.
One attendee is seeking direction on how to handle the overload of assessments that will be due within 30 days upon return.
Yeah, I guess everybody's looking at me. The big answer is we don't know. People should be discussing this with their with their team who already does assessments and working with them for a way to look at calendars, triage, plan ahead. They may need to engage in side agreements that would authorize additional pay for after hours work or weekends. They may want to consider within the parameters of physical distancing, possibly reopen for small amounts of assessments depending on the needs of the assessor and the student. And there may be a boon for contractors to be hired to complete assessment. There is no one-size-fits-all answer, and given that many of our assessors are already hard to find, hard to fill positions, it's going to be a big challenge.
Right, and I do think that triaging is the important key factor there. And Sarah, I know that you had some input on that subject.
Yeah, I do. I think this comes back to that forward planning we were talking about and thinking about we're going to encounter that when we reopen, whenever that is, and anything we can do now to be planning for that, the better. And one of the things I think we need to do is triage those assessments and figure out what needs to happen first. If we're looking at initial eligibility to get a student into programming, that needs to happen quickly. If we're looking at students who maybe we're recommending a change of placement, that needs to happen quickly. I am not usually one to recommend the utilization of record review for triennial assessments, but if ever there was a time to consider the practicality and applicability of that part of the law, now is it. If there is a triennial that can be completed through records review for some of our older students who have been assessed several times and have shown stable profiles and stable needs, now might be the time to do that. I'm also recommending that districts very thoughtfully think about, are there portions of the assessment that can happen now? We can do parent interviews now through technology. We may not be able to administer individual testing instruments, but there are portions we can do records review now, review past assessments now. Those things that can be done ahead of time shouldn't wait until the fall just because in-person assessment is waiting until the fall. So it really comes down to putting a proactive plan in place to try and minimize the impacts of that as much as possible.
Another attendee asks whether classified staff can be in breakout rooms in Zoom without general ed or special ed teachers present.
So I'll give you the practitioner answer, and then maybe a lawyer can make sure to give a lawyer answer. But the supervisory rules for classified staff is that their work must be directed by, generated by, and supervised by a certificated teacher. There is nothing in that guidance that said that must include a physical presence. So we have classified staff who take students out in the past, before, would take students out in the community for community-based instruction without the teacher being physically present. We have classified staff who have implemented the work developed by and supervised by the educational specialist without that certificated person being physically present. Of course, every district gets to make its own local determination, and the certificated staff should be clear and aware of the skills and/or limitations of the classified staff. But there is no requirement for there to be a physical presence of that credentialed teacher for 100% of that work.
Agreed.
I would agree. I think you described it very well.
Yay.
Great. This question, and if we've already addressed it and there's no new nuance here, just let me know and we can move on. But the question is, what guidance and advice are you giving LEAs about implementation of behavior plans that were developed based on FBAs conducted in the traditional school context? And how are you advising that new behaviors that are interfering with learning be addressed?
So I think I'll take this one and to start. Because I feel like I may have already provided a bit of an answer, but right now, in terms of my role, we're not directing LEAs to do anything. We're sharing with them possible solutions, good ideas we've heard elsewhere. We're brainstorming with them, but we believe that they need to be individually considering and determining what would be appropriate and what is appropriate given the circumstances for that child. There was specifically a webinar on addressing behavior and mental health that occurred, I think it was last week even, that's available on the CDE website. If you go to the CDE main page and click on the COVID resources, it's one of the top webinars that's on the list of all of the COVID resources for education. And it's very possible that one of the related services that needs to be figured out for that child is how to work out a consultation or some time with someone who is aware of their behavioral needs or has been a part of developing and implementing their behavioral plan.
Thanks for that, and Jeanette. Another question talks about future planning and remediation. Are there any tools or informal tests that schools can use to identify the needs for remediation? Or is it just, as you discussed earlier in your responses, that they're going to have to use the tools that they've traditionally used?
I think remediation is going to have to be, for special ed kids, is going to have to be based on the individual needs of those children. And so the IEP team will have to look at where they're at, what progress they've made since schools closed, and now how can they move that child forward.
And I think that's done routinely without the need for formalized assessment. Our educators are assessing our student needs every day that they work with them, right? So whatever tools are being used within the curriculum adopted by the district, within the program being taught by the providers. I don't believe that we're going to have to formally assess every student in order to determine remediation moving forward. I think that really comes back to just the really good teaching education that we do. I mean, education, when I was in the classroom, it was a while ago, but educational planning is always based on how kids present today. That determines what I'm going to work on tomorrow. And we're assessing needs as we go, in that really formative way to make sure that we're figuring out individually how to move those students where they need to go.
Great.
I would agree. And I would also just add in that many special educators also have an assessment that they do on progress for goals and objectives, which is what many people and districts use to consider eligibility for ESY. And so it could be that we see an expansion of that kind of assessment. The way that you assess for regression and or difficulty with recruitment is to measure where the student was before an absence and after an extended absence. So we'll have that opportunity now, but we're not doing a standardized assessment. We're looking at where were they on the goals where I was keeping data and where are they now? So that picture in time, and then we respond to that.
Got it. I'm trying to sneak in a couple more questions. This last one is pretty involved, but I'll connect it. Essentially, the person who poses the question says, talking about classified employees who work in the special ed department. Apparently in this district, they often ask if they are supposed to sign IEP documents as translators. Apparently they perform translation services, even though that may not be their specific job classification. And they're wondering what the protocols are around that.
I think that's a very complicated question, you're right, and a complicated answer. There are entire 2 to 3 day trainings that we do for people who appropriately serve as translators. LEAs should have some sort of requirement for people who serve as interpreters or translators. So there's really a lot of local decision making there, local guidance from that special education director, and a need for training for people who are going to be serving as interpreters and translators for the technical IEP process. So I think it would be difficult to answer more clearly here unless someone with legal background wants to take a stab.
Well, I would just say the only thing I would say is that in terms of signing the IEP, there's a portion of the IEP where you sign in attendance at the IEP meeting. So to the extent that this person is in attendance at the IEP meeting, that person should be signing to document the fact that they have attended this IEP in whatever role that they were meant to serve for that IEP. So.
And I will just reiterate what Anjanette said earlier in her slides, which is this might be a really good opportunity during distance learning and school closures, some extra training for your classified staff if they need that.
Yeah.
Great. And then we'll wrap it up with one final question, which I think sort of summarizes the issue for many of our school board members who are on the webinar. And that is, if you are a school board trustee, what questions should you be asking your superintendent and your special education directors to make sure that districts are serving students well and that the district is accountable for quality education to students?
For me, it would go back to the basics again about the forward thinking, about the thoughtful consideration about what services we're providing during this distance learning period, and then also the progress on goals and the remediation conversation that we had. I mean, I feel like people are waiting till we get to a particular point in time, and then they'll decide, oh, now let's look, and see what a student needs, but that's not the case. Obviously, as Sarah talked about, we had no idea back in March that we would still be in a distance learning phase, during this period of time, and we may be in the fall. So the point is, use the time now to evaluate the thoughtful considerations of what services you're able to provide and the progress on goals that students are making.
And then I would close by saying, ask them what they need to be successful. Many of them have a laptop, but maybe don't feel like they have the training or the background or a solid foundation. They might feel more confident if they had access to a PD. They might feel more confident if they were given some access to a network of peers. Lots of our educators work in silos already, and it's sometimes hard to feel connected. That's even harder right now. Zoom is not a connection. Zoom is a platform. And so we need to be supporting them physically, mentally, emotionally, so that they can continue to really do the hard work they're doing and be successful educators, participants in our educational system, and also in their private lives. So we may need to be asking them, what do you need for us to make you successful?
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And I would close by saying, all of the topics we've talked about today are good things to ask about. How are we providing services? How are we logging those services? How are we communicating with parents? How have we overcome these obstacles? But I think more importantly, the question is, what have we learned so far? And what questions do we still have to answer? So that we can work together, as Anjanette said, by asking you, how can I help you? Answer the questions that we still need to answer as we move forward in this time period. We've learned so much that we want to make sure we're capitalizing on what we have learned so far in that forward planning, and we want to make sure that we are paying attention to the questions that we have not yet answered and working very thoughtfully on plans moving forward so that we can continue. As I mentioned earlier, I have been astonished by the efforts being put in by administrators and teachers and parents and students during this time period. People have risen to the challenge, and it has been quite a challenge. We have learned so much. Let's make sure we take advantage of those extraordinary efforts that have been made and take that learning forward so that we can really even more successfully give our students access during this distance learning period and give them access to progress moving forward.
Excellent. That's a
Thank you.
great spot for us to end. So I want to thank our panelists and then leave you with just a little bit more information about where you can get more tools on COVID-19 response to help serve your students. Next slide, please. Well, okay, great. I was going to say, next slide, please. Other direction.
There you go.
Thank you. So we have one more installment remaining in our COVID-19 series. It's called Supporting Student Wellbeing from Afar, and it focuses on how we can support students' physical and mental health at a time when they're not on campus and we don't have that in-person interaction. A very important part because it's not just about academic loss, we are also losing our ability to support students who have mental and physical health needs, and to the extent we can mitigate that, a lot of our resources should be directed toward that goal. Finally, before we go, I've mentioned the website before, but I'll do it once more, csba.org/coronavirus. A lot of information, resources, and tools there. And recently, we've added an advocacy section. That's very important. With most likely tomorrow at noon, the governor will be unveiling his May revised budget. It could be pretty grim and likely will not be the schools as his January budget proposal was, with cuts very likely coming. We need to rally the education community to advocate for the funding needed, provide all kids a high quality education, particularly with the additional challenges and expenses related to COVID-19 response. And you can get some tools to circulate within your community to advocate for proper school funding. They're on the website, in addition to a number of other resources. Next slide, please. So thank you for joining us today. We hope to see you for our final webinar in the COVID-19 series. If you have any questions about this webinar or other issues related to CSBA, don't hesitate to email me. Again, my name is Troy Flint. You can reach me at tflint@csba.org, or you can email our general mailbox at csba@csba.org. Thanks again for your time. We hope to see you soon. Take care.
Thank you.